wasn't going to film this, but I've got quite an extreme example here. This one's going to go a long way down, and as I've said in the past, it's just this measurement and you put it on here. But obviously it seems that people are a bit worried about doing things by eye, so you can, if you want, measure it. We've got a drop of, let's say, 18 centimeters. So let's just try and make this really clear. I can now take 18 centimeters out of both logs anywhere I like. So we've got this hole here, so I'll try and get rid of that. So let's go there to there. We're going to do these angles, and it's always the first one, the top one first, so that you can see that one while you're doing the bottom one. And I'll go ahead and just draw that. Let's just get rid of that hole. We'll go down like that. I wouldn't draw this next one. You could just do this. I wouldn't do that. I would cut this one first in case it doesn't go exactly perfectly, and then measure it down. I'll go ahead and get started with that anyway. So I'm going to go up, and it's going to be to about there. So I've done that first cut, followed the line, didn't go perfectly, started out on the line down here, a little bit above the line here. Doesn't matter because we're doing that one first, then we do the second one according to that one. And like I said, if you want to measure it, now would be the time to measure it. So this was 18, let's check it. Yeah, we're about right. So we want to go 18 on the other side. So we're about there. So the line is something like that. Don't worry about it too much. Now, those plywood pieces that I was talking about, which you could now put in there, it's useful when you come to cutting this. I'm kind of recapping here, but that's all right, because then the log doesn't move. But the plywood pieces, whether it's under snow or under wood shavings, whatever, I was losing them all the time. So I had an idea, and turns out it might even be a good idea. I painted them fluorescent. So now what happens? If I was doing this by eye, or even now, not only is this log stabilized, but I've got a really visible line that I can now follow to get the angle right. So that cut that I made is actually not perfectly flat, it's like that, which is why this is tight. But that's alright, we fix all that in the next stage.
Yeah, the next stage, and that's obviously what this video is all meant to be about. This is the stage where we do the lateral groove. That's the groove on the bottom of the log as it drops onto the log underneath. And we're going to go back to diagrams now, because the best way for this to work is to understand the real basics of how this is supposed to work in an ideal situation. Now, I know an ideal situation never actually occurs, but if you understand the principles of how it would work in a perfect situation, it becomes obvious in which ways you need to change things to make it work, given the non-ideal circumstances that you're always going to encounter. Now, you may remember in an earlier part in this series that I said this.
To imagine this line in here, and for instance on this way, if the line is there, I'm going to cut on the outside of that line. So we're going 9 centimeters plus one blade width.
So why do we add that blade width? Well, here's what the situation will look like once you put the log on and you added that blade width. You're going to have these gaps, one at either end on the corners. Now, we've made these spacers, so once you put the spacers in, you're then able to run the chainsaw along in between the two logs horizontally and take out, well, exactly one chain width, which is the same as those spacers. So then when you take those spacers out, everything should just drop nicely into place. Now a whole load of questions arise, and we'll take those one at a time and move through them. The first would be, is that horizontal cut between the logs going to be enough to give a good surface of wood touching wood all the way along that log? And again, it depends on the kind of building you're doing. It may be that that's all you need. If it's an out building, maybe for drying wood, as I've said before, that's fine. Now you remember in my case, at the point where we are in the video that you've seen so far, I'm still using those hewn logs, and they have the lateral groove already taken out underneath them. So in my case, what I'm finding is twice. So where on that previous diagram I had the line where the chainsaw goes through in between the two logs horizontally, I'm finding that going through twice is about perfect in this particular situation. Meaning we've cut through once, we've dropped the log, and then we're going to cut through again. Now obviously we can't do it in that order, because as you see up there, we're taking out 2 chain widths, but there was only room to drop a 1 chain width at each end. But that was on purpose, because if you take a step back and flip around to have a look at the ends of the logs, well, now the order that this will work becomes obvious. You've done your first horizontal cut in between the logs all the way along. You've taken your spacers out. You've dropped the log down. Now move to the end of the log, and what you'll see is that this joint here, it's very difficult to get those angles right first time every time, but now's the perfect time to adjust that. Just run the chainsaw through there. What you're doing at the same time is creating a perfect spot for putting the spacers back in, which then allows you to run the chainsaw along in between the logs a second time. Take the spacers out again, and the whole thing drops down. You've got 2 chain widths of height that you've dropped between those logs, so you've got a decent surface, and you've fixed all the angles at the ends of the logs so they look perfect and no one will ever know you got them wrong in the first place. Now at this stage in the video, I'm still using those reclaimed logs that have been once used, so they have the lateral groove cut out, and which I thought was going to be an advantage. It turns out that it's not an advantage. I actually have to make 2 cuts instead of one on each side, and the good news is that it turns out it's much easier with the round logs. Now traditionally the lateral groove will look like this, and what I'm talking about is simply putting the saw blade straight through in between the logs and running it along. Is that okay? Well, I would certainly concede that it's probably not as good, so you could classify this as one of the compromises I'm making with this system. But before I get hate mail from log builders, I just draw your attention to the log building system called butt and pass, where all the horizontal contact between the logs is simply a horizontal line, surface against surface. Okay, back to work. First uppercut. Spacer in place. Lower uppercut. All the same at the other end. First undercut. Move the log. Second undercut. Then that last cut on the side, and the same at the other end. Take out all the pieces. Now, what happened here is, turns out I took out a little bit too much on that right hand side, so that the middle of the log is touching down, but the gap on the end is more than a blade width. No problem, just put in 2 spacers. And 2 spacers at the other end. Then I can just run the chainsaw through in between the 2 logs where they're touching. In this case that means just a little bit at that right hand side. And because I'm still using those hewn logs, I have to run round and do it on the other side as well. But then I can take out one of those spacers at each end and we're back to the situation we were aiming for in the first place.
Okay, in the film you're seeing now, this is the last of those hewn logs that I put onto the building. And what you'll notice is I'm spending a lot of time basically walking backwards and forwards, running around. I've got to cut one side of the log, then I've got to run around and cut the other side of the log. Take a spacer out and then repeat. So I think this compromise that we're making with the lateral grooves is worth it. It's going to save a lot of time. Now the question comes how much to drop the logs, and with these hewn logs I've been dropping it by 2 cuts. With the round logs I'm finding about 3 cuts is good. And something you need to understand, when I'm saying dropping it by 1 blade width, 1 blade width in vertical height doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually translates to quite a wide area of flat wood to touch down. You cut it once, cut it twice, cut it 3 times, you're talking about a really wide lateral groove. So that's something I'm happy about. Now, the next concept is the path of least resistance. See that first cut that you make, when the logs are barely touching, they may only be touching in a couple of places, you can run the saw through there really quickly and easily. The key is to hold the saw really lightly and just let the saw pull you along. Don't push, and the saw will on its own find the path of least resistance and take a bit off of both logs. Now that is also still true on the second cut, but less so. So you have to be a little bit careful. Now, because the resistance is built up, there's more wood that you're cutting through. It's the difference in feel as the saw is pulling is different. There's less of a difference between going through a thicker part than a thinner part, so you need to try and really feel the saw as it goes. But on the second cut it still works. On the third cut, that path of least resistance
it's not really working for you anymore. So I came up with a secret weapon. These are more pieces of plywood, but they're half the thickness of a chain width. So when your logs are touching down, just add these spacers, half a blade width to each end, and again, the saw will now follow the path of least resistance. You'll take off half a blade width of wood, and because we're now dealing with flat lateral grooves, you can now put one of our orange spacers, the ones that are one blade width, in there in between the logs. Take the green half a blade width spacers out at the end and run the saw through there, the ends. And then when you take the full blade width spacer out from underneath the logs, there you go. And the nice thing is, with this path of least resistance method, it's really quick, really easy. Okay, I think this snow is going to start to turn to sleet soon. I'm going to head home. But another big advantage to the straight lateral groove is that it can be done from one side of the wall. So it cuts out all the running backwards and forwards. That log there took me just about 15 minutes, so I'm slowing down. I'm sure a large part of the reason for that is all the walking backwards and forwards. But imagine later on in the build when the wall gets high. Now, with a flat lateral groove that you can do from one side of the wall, which would be the outside, you only need to have a scaffold or a platform on one side of the wall instead of having to have scaffolding on both sides. So after this log, I moved on to round logs that had not been used before, so they're not reclaimed logs. They don't have that lateral groove already cut in the bottom, and it's turned out to be a big advantage not having that. With the round logs though, there are one or two little extra things you have to do. Obviously we're dealing with round logs, so they will tend to move around a lot more because I don't have that stabilizing lateral groove on the bottom. So a couple of steps to mitigate those problems. I make a little notch where the log is going to sit on the wall. Now obviously, as we've already covered, the log should sit one blade width outside the center line of the wall, so it's not perpendicularly above the log underneath, it's a blade width out. So those notches, you take that into account, move it a little bit out. The notches are not terribly deep. I've tried to aim so that the notch is such that when the log sits in, that's it gone down a blade width. Everything's blade widths, and that means that when I'm working out how much to drop the log, I don't need to add a blade width. It's already dropped that much, so I can just straight transfer the distance between the two logs and take that much out of the logs in the notch. Also, I use this stabilizing bar, if you like. It's just a piece of wood with two big nails put in, just to try and keep that log stable while I do all the cuts and things. It's turned out to work quite well. The other extra step with the round logs is to create two faces at the end of each log. So it's two cuts at an angle. The angle will depend on the length of your chainsaw bar. So make it as long as possible, and that just gives you two faces and means that we can go back to all the cuts being straight lines. Once you've done those two cuts at each end, the system continues exactly as it did before. So this video has gone a bit longer than I usually do, but work commitments mean that I'm going to have to put a hold on this project, and I really wanted to get onto the round logs to show you how those work, what the differences are, so that you've got everything you need if you want to try this system. So that's where we are now. So just to recap, we've got a system where we can lift a log up on the wall and we can drop it down into place using what's effectively a half dovetail joint. We can do it without moving it once it's in place. We can do it with just a chainsaw, with no measuring, with no drawing. But we don't have the problems that would normally come along with that. We don't have the chainsaw blade width size gaps that you would normally end up with. We don't have the situation of getting the chainsaw trapped as the log drops. We've added a step which allows you to even out any mistakes you make, because you're not measuring and drawing things. That doesn't matter, because we've got a step in there that brings the accuracy back, if you like. You can sort out those joints in the notches. We've made a compromise with the lateral groove in that it's now a horizontal lateral groove, just like in the button power system. But we get a decent wide lateral groove. It's easy to do, it's quick to do, and because we've just added those few pieces of plywood, it's pretty much infinitely adjustable. Now, we've compromised perhaps on the quality of the joints, but actually let's look at the last hewn log that I did, how the joints turned out. So I apologize for the shaky camera work here, but as you can see, the joints are not bad. I don't think I'd be able to get them a lot better if I had drawn them as you normally would. But as I said, I had to take a break from this project, but I'm hoping that these 3 short videos are enough for you to get a handle on what it is I've been trying to do and have a go yourself. Now, in these 3 short videos, I haven't had time to go into everything. I haven't, for instance, talked about pegging. You should be putting pegs in these logs. If you want to know about pegging, I'll put a link in the top right of the screen now to a video that I've done in one of my previous log building series, which goes into the subject of pegging. But there's something I really wanted to mention about pegs, and I mean, this whole system is about speeding things up and making some compromises, and pegs is something you might want to think about making some compromises on if time is really an issue. I know this is gonna infuriate log builders, but for instance, during this whole project, in the background you've seen another building. That's a log building that I put up 14 years ago. I had time constraints in that these are big logs. I needed lifted equipment. I only had the lifting equipment for a short period of time, and I put that building up. There isn't a single peg in the whole building, and it's been fine. I also a few years ago had to take an old log building down. It was a small 35 square meter building, 3 rooms, and I was taking the building down to reuse the logs for another project, and the only pegs in the whole building were pegs either side of the doors. So how essential the pegs are, how many pegs you need to do, I put a question mark on that. Like I said, I know I'm going to get pushback. And incidentally, yes, as you can see, this building also doesn't have any foundations. I just cut down some trees and used the stumps as corner posts for the building. Okay, so back on topic. So just how much faster is this than normal log building? Well, there you go. Now let's round that up. Let's say 10 minutes per log. Let's double that because you're going to have to do some pegs and move logs. Let's triple it because you're going to have a coffee break now and again. 16 logs a day. These logs are average about 3 meters each. The longest wall is longer, the shortest wall is shorter. But so 8-hour day, 16 logs, that's 45 meters of logs. Now when I'm making a proposal for a customer, I'm looking at what kind of building they want, and I'm trying to figure out how long it's going to take me. With normal log building, I am working it out at about 10 to 15 meters of log I'm going to get done per day. So we've quartered the time. You can do this in 1/4, 25% of the time. Now, is that worth the compromises? It might be. Is it worth maybe someone giving it a try? Let me know what you think. If you've got questions, if there's something I haven't explained well enough, then leave me a comment and question below. Now, I'm going to carry on with this project, obviously, at some point. Depends on work. But if you want to see how that all turns out, this little building, then if you're not subscribed already, then subscribe and you'll get a notification. I only upload a few videos per year, so you're not going to be bombarded with notifications. But I'm going to sign off here. I'm really interested to know what people think, so let me know. Thanks.